Hello everyone and welcome to a very special bonus episode of the Cacophony Sessions. My name is Dan and today I'm joined by regular Tom, and we are also excited to be graced with the presence of a journalist who's written for Melody Maker, NME, was editor for The Wire and Uncut, and has published books on a number of subjects from Eminem to krautrock. He's also featured on one of my favourite podcasts, Chart Music, where he's known as rock expert David Stubbs.
Rock expert.
Tonight, considering we have an expert on, we're going to be setting our sights on British music, specifically 1977 to 1979 in the pre-Thatcher era. We'll be looking at the best singles, the best albums, and the most overrated acts from the time. But first, David, I do believe we've got two questions for you that we do for all of our guests. So let's get this out of the way, shall we? I need to know what your favourite year in music is, and then I need to know what you would classify as an undeniable banger before me and Tom tonight.
Right. Well, my favourite year is 1988. Now, the reason is, I say that, I don't necessarily assert that it was the greatest year, but I think it's, that I had such a strong association with that year. I actually wrote a piece at the end of the year saying it had been the greatest year for music of all time. And the reason I was making that sort of rather cheeky assertion was that I just felt we're in an era which I think sampling had an element to do with this, but also a kind of slightly innovated mood of post-modernity or something like that, where there was a sense that there was nothing new under the sun and that everything had really been done in the 60s and 70s, and everything was just a kind of rather pale and inferior sort of take on all of that. And sometimes the fact that people were referencing back to Led Zeppelin or James Brown, that these are the truly glorious days. And I wanted to kind of make an assertion for the present and the immediate future by kind of making claims from 1988. I think this is the year of Public Enemy, Young Gods, My Bloody Valentine, all of these things that, we were kind of celebrating in print, this kind of reinflation, as it were, of rock and a kind of almost like a kind of notional epic significance, even if it wasn't, even if these people weren't kind of changing lives and filling out stadia, the way they had in the 60s or 70s, that the rock music as a thing in itself was doing things and taking shapes and forms, and that had actually been undreamt of, 20 years earlier. So I suppose it was that idea. It's like, hip hop is something that really, really starting to kick in. You got, things coming in from Europe, like the Sugar Cubes and stuff like that, ALK, and all of this massive, sonically massive stuff, all happening at once. Big Black Butthole Surfers have been around for a while, all that kind of thing. And I think it's also the fact that as a staff writer at Melody Maker, I felt in a position to kind of, almost be part of the culture in a sense, in terms of celebrating it, writing about it in a particular way, the materiality of it. That's not really occurred since. It certainly didn't occur before. I've been at Melody Maker since 1986, but I'd almost been really sort of knocking around waiting for something to happen that you could really, really sort of celebrate in a prose, in a particular kind of prose. And I think it was really beginning to happen in 1987, and it was really culminating in 1988. And I think that things kind of slightly began to peter out for me in 1989. All of a sudden, it was almost like, that moment had kind of passed, really, as these do. It's a bit like 1982 and then 1983, where you sense that like things are kind of reach an absolute crest, but then things kind of receded again. So yeah, my claim is for 1988.
I can see that. I mean, Daydream Nation came out in 1988, didn't it? So, and I love that album. And Pixies, Surfer Rosa. So yeah, I can definitely see a case for 88.
One of my favourite Prince albums. It came out in 88. Love Sexy.
Yeah, I went to the Love Sexy gig.
Oh wow.
He'd not come a year early. He was supposed to tour Sign of the Times in the UK, but he didn't do it. Apparently, he thought the weather was going to be rubbish, so he was going to do some massive outdoor thing. As it turned out, the weather was cloudless, glorious days. He cancelled for, but There you go. In the same spirit as you claim 2003, and saying make a case for the times that we're in. Don't have this. There's a hell of a lot of nostalgia and retrospection, in rock music culture, and has been for a long time. Whatever, an inferiority complex about the times that you're in, and looking back now, in 1988, people just laugh because they just thought that 1988 was just another year of diminishing returns and the encroaching insignificance of rock music. But now people look back on it as in much the same ways they might the 70s and 60s.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, so I set myself a challenge at the beginning of this year to listen to 5 new albums every week for the whole year, and I've achieved it so far this year.
Somehow.
I don't know. I don't know how. And I can say that this year is definitely up there with, it's going to be one of the best years for music. I think some of the stuff that's been coming out is absolutely fantastic. You've got so currently my album of the year contender, really, from who I've banged on about before. Even Dan's listened to it eventually after I banged on it about it for weeks. And the new Wolf Alice album, I didn't love it, but it's getting rave reviews. Japanese Breakfast released an album that's really cool. That came out a couple of days ago. Then there's bands like Famous and Squid. So yeah, this year is, I think, if you ask me next year what the best year for music is, I think I might say this one.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm finding various things. I suppose from a critical point of view, as I say, I find it difficult to kind of place. I think it's like everything is happening all the time, everywhere, sort of thing. You could talk in the 70s, 80s, 90s about tendencies and dialectical shifts and all this kind of stuff. And because music, there's so much of everything being made. It's harder to do that. Plus, you don't have a kind of central agency like the music press, or whatever, where you can make something of these things. You can create a sort of dimension to kind of all this really good music by profiling the people, celebrating them, images of them, whatever. That creates that other dimension to them. I mean, obviously, sleeve art used to do that, but sleeve art isn't really such a thing anymore. It isn't part of the whole sort of iconic package, as it were. Anymore, so there are dimensions. There is undoubtedly great music, but there isn't the central agency of a music press to celebrate it. I mean, people like the Quieters do fantastic work, but it's not quite the same. It doesn't have quite the same sort of reach.
It's harder to have a universal appeal in today's market because everybody goes to their own echo chambers on the internet to get the opinions. So it's harder to break through and get that opinion out to everybody.
There isn't a top of the pops. I mean, the 21st century has been minus top of the pops, so you don't you don't have that anymore.
And Spotify only plays you things that it thinks you'll like. I mean, a great resource that I've been using, I'm sure you've found it already, is the albumoftheyear.org. They list basically every album that's come out or coming out, with almost like a Metacritic score and user scores and reviews. And I find that very useful for finding new music because it's just who's reviewed well across the board. So that's quite good. But no, there isn't any. You're right, there isn't anything. And I think that it's harder to diversify what you're listening to if you don't know where to look to find it. I mean, and the days of Pitchfork being a massive website seem to be over, because that was the big thing about 10, 15 years ago. You used to go to Pitchfork and you'd find everything would be on there. I may have not always agreed with their reviews, but you could always find new music that way. And before that, it was like Enemy. I used to read religiously.
And of course, it's the curse of abundance. One of the great glorious things about the 70s for me was it was nearer scarcity, and if I wanted to, buying those Stevie Wonder albums, like Innovisions, I would have to save it for 4 weeks on a paper round. And I did that for various things. I went through a Bob Dylan phase, of buying, all kind of, and some of those albums actually I found pretty austere, actually. But, I'd spent 4 weeks of paper round money on them. So, I bloody well learnt to like them.
Yeah.
As best I could. I gritted my teeth and got through John Wesley Harding,
The second question is the perpetual question on this channel. What is an undeniable banger? So it's a song that everybody knows and everybody loves. Let's see if you can get one into the Hall of Fame, David.
Have you done SOS Band, Just Be Good to Me?
We covered that on the last episode.
This is the trouble with an undeniable banger like that. There's a more modern one, which is that absolutely grabs me every single time. It's like Scuba. Adrenaline. Do you know Scuba at all?
I don't know that one.
No.
I mean, like Crank It Up. I mean, it's just got that sort of sense of, dance floor levitation and hugeness, which is a similar quality that you get with, just be good to me. The sense of like something huge is being launched here or whatever, with the dance floor was the kind of the ground bass. Similar sort of feel to that. This enormous swirling, rotating sort of beat. That's and then the drop and everything like that. It's just a huge, epic sort of neo house track. I don't know much about Scuba. It's British, and I don't really care to actually, because sometimes when when you actually find out about creators of things like this, the information's a bit prosaic, really, and sometimes I just want to say Scuba.
Need to leave a little bit of mystery with some of these acts.
Definitely. I quite like that sometimes, actually.
Yeah. Well, the SOS band, Just Be Good to Me, I love that tune.
Absolutely.
Tom's not a massive fan of it.
No, I'm not.
That's my kind of genre. That's my bread and butter, is big extended funk jams, especially when Jam and Lewis are involved. Well, as a big Prince fan, that ticks all the boxes for me.
Yes, absolutely.
If Adrenaline is similar to that, I shall be checking that one out, I think.
We'll give it a spin, and it might end up on the list at the next episode.
Yeah. Keep checking the blog. We've got our list of undeniable bangers up on there.
Check it out if it gets the raspberry, never mind.
We'll let you know.
Yeah.
So we are here to talk about British music, specifically from 1977 to 1979. We're going to go through our favourite albums of that period, favourite singles, and acts that we find maybe not to our taste, or maybe have been critically overrated on a general level. But before we do that, maybe a bit of context surrounding why this particular era is so important to you, and why you want to talk about this on the podcast tonight.
I've kind of been thinking of taking a sort of a much deeper dive into this, really, possibly in a book, really, and looking at this era, not necessarily restricting it just to sort of British, because obviously, like foreign, other musics like Kraftwerk was sort of becoming so influential on what was actually happening in Britain, and it wasn't like a sort of hermetically sealed sort of musical environment. But I'm just fascinated by Britain in the late 70s and the conditions that created punk and the conditions that created Thatcherism, perhaps being one of the same, almost like two sides of the same coin. And, a certain sense that, things being kind of jaded and a bit mouldy and second rate, that inspired the sort of the jolt of electricity that was punk and, and complacent perhaps, or whatever. And I think it was a similar sort of sense of Britain's moribundness and second rateness, or whatever, and that drove people towards Thatcherism. That Britain was somehow kind of, I don't know, in a sense, a stalemate and hidebound, and that the unions were overpowerful, heavy inverted commas there. But 1979 for me, we're still living in the post conditions of politically post 1979. So I'm just fascinated. Like music, is obviously one sort of strong aspect of things. Reflecting the sort of state of things, the state of mind. But I've been also looking at other things. Anything. I mean, I'm just written a book about British comedy. So perform British comedy, looking at the way that there was this mood of declinism that you got in the sort of mid to late 70s, all that kind of thing. But it's also the idea of Thatcherism didn't have to be, it didn't have to happen, and a lot of the kind of music of that era, is great stuff, and it suggests alternative worlds, other paths, other possibilities.
Yeah.
Well, the polls suggested that if Callaghan had called an election 3 months either side of when he did, Thatcher wouldn't have got in.
Yeah.
And we'd have all been saved from this aftermath that's gone on ever since.
It would have been a completely utopian society, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, probably not, but it would wouldn't have been. I don't think that the political darkness that we are suffering today would exist in the same way. And that would certainly be a good thing.
Definitely, yeah. What were you doing in this period, David?
I would have been at school. So 1977, I hadn't quite sort of acquired this sense of critical discernment. That came in 1978, early 1978, when I was 15. I picked up a book about Stevie Wonder and read it, and I also started reading the music press, Melody Maker, in fact, at the same time, and I was suddenly kind of seized with this sense of critical discernment and the cultural importance that some music was more important than other music. Some music was banal and commercially driven. Other music had meaning and soul. Very sort of basic entry level sort of music critic type, values. I mean, come across as, and actually did come across as, insufferably pompous to most of to friends and my brothers and people like that. And obviously over time I kind of perhaps sort of refined those particular ideas. But I suppose I still stand by them to in a more refined way. But that's what I was doing. Yeah. So I was just at school. Yeah, I was earning money from a paper round, and I was spending all my money on from early 1970. I just spent all of my money on records, or acquired records in the record library. I was just a bedroom boy. I didn't go out anywhere at all. I was I was monastic really, and quite religious at the same time. Actually, I was brought up a Catholic, and I think I decided to take Catholicism. I'm an atheist these days, but back then, take my religion a bit more seriously, to kind of bolster this great sense of morality. And Stevie Wonder, who was a tremendous influence, he was obviously very religious.
Yeah.
Even Bob Dylan turned religious for a bit there, but that was about 1980.
I must be one of the only people that is a fan of Bob Dylan's 80s religious blues rock period. Compared to his earlier stuff, I much prefer it, but I'm probably alone in that.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. I'm fully aware, it's fine. We're all allowed our strange opinions. Tom and I we would have been minus 10 in 1977. So it's been an interesting exercise because I've gone back to listen to albums that maybe I wasn't as familiar with as I should have, some of the classics. So I've listened to about 10 to 15 albums from this period that are essential listening by most of the publications out there, and all the awards and even the charts. Gone back and listened to what was popular. So it's been really ear opening in terms of discovering this new music. But I think we're going to have some good nominations. I think we'll start with what we think are the best singles of that period. I will open with there were several songs that I nearly picked, and this could have gone one of many ways. Originally, I was going to do "Miss You" by the Rolling Stones because it's my favourite Rolling Stones song. Mm-hmm. I was also really tempted to go for "Walking on the Moon" by the Police, simply because of the drumming on that track. Stuart Copeland only hits the snare drum once on that entire song, and it's a powerhouse of a number one single that I think really led the way forward for many bands in the 80s, especially there were other acts as well that opened the door for ska and dub acts, but I think seeing that get to number one was an important moment. There were also various other songs. "Heroes" by David Bowie is one that I couldn't not mention. Ultimately, though, I've gone for Joe Jackson's "Is She Really Going Out With Him?"
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Simply because I absolutely adore that song. I'm removed from the period, so I first heard it growing up, probably in the early 90s to mid 90s, and my dad was a fan of that song, and Joe Jackson in general. "Look Sharp," the album, is actually a really good album. But the reason I've gone for this song, I just think there's an identifiableness in the lyrics. Growing up as a teenager, everyone's been kind of jealous of a guy that the girl you like is going with, and you can't understand it. And there's a sneeriness to it as well. It's a great song from that perspective. I think the production on it was from David Kirschenbaum. David Kirschenbaum did production on Rio a few years later with Duran Duran. It's got radio friendly texture to it. It's a pop end of the new wave spectrum, and yeah, I just think it's a forgotten song when discussed with the other classics of the period, but it has had a good legacy. It's been in films. I think it was featured in There's Something About Mary in 1998. So it's got a legacy. It's well known, but I think that compared to other classics of the era, it doesn't really get the recognition it deserves from then. I think Joe Jackson's quite he's quite an independent artist in that not many people would see him or recognise his name today. In fact, if you said Joe Jackson, I think most people would go, "Oh, what? Michael Jackson's dad released a song." When you look at the artist, you'll very quickly realise they're not related. But Joe Jackson himself was quite a varied artist. He had a lot of almost kind of swing elements to some of his later stuff. But yeah, great song, great artist. It was released in 1978. It sounds ahead of its time. It's got great guitar, great production, this sneering vocal, which was so typical for the punk sound of the time. So I think it appealed to a lot of different demographics in terms of its crossover appeal. And yeah, I really love it. What do you guys think?
That's interesting. You make a very good case for it. I don't dislike it. I suppose even at the time, yes, like you say, it captures as very articulately a certain kind of adolescent miserablism, pretty women walking with gorillas in my street, And what I probably thought then, perhaps now, is that part of how great I think it is perhaps contingent on to what extent Joe Jackson is being very, very self-pitying here, or if he's just being a good songwriter and this is, and he's telling a story, and this is just a narrator. It's I suppose it would depend a little bit on that. I'd probably never I would probably never think giving it that higher rating, because I tend to associate Joe Jackson with there was a sort of hiatus between punk and then post-punk, and which he had a lot of new wave and stiff and stuff like that, and he did get a kind of sort of slightly sort of jerky, power poppy, everybody's singing like that.
Yeah.
And I thought, is this really what Sid, what Sid's going to die for in a bit? Is this really what comes after punk? So I generally, as a general sort of thing, I found new wave a bit disappointing, and I'd hoped for better things and that, and better things eventually did emerge. But it's 1978, this era. I was generally a little bit sort of, I didn't mind it. I didn't mind a lot of the sort of stiff record stuff, Lennon Lovitch or whatever. But I just thought, is this as good as it gets? Is this what the bequest is?
Are we really going out with this?
Yeah, we're really going out with this. So I kind of probably associated it negatively with that, which is probably unfair. And that's probably the way that I tend to look at things. I've been thinking about this a bit recently, that the way that I was a bit as a music critic, perhaps in the late 80s, I didn't necessarily take things on their own intrinsic merits. I once reviewed a Micro Disney album and I denounced it essentially because it wasn't the Young Gods. And that's not really fair on Micro Disney. And perhaps a similar sort of thing is, has perhaps held me back from giving a sense of the proper due of Joe Jackson. Yeah. So you make a very good case for it. It did surprise me.
Yeah. I grew up listening to this track because it's my dad is not really into music. My mum was very into music. My dad wasn't that into music. And this is one of the few records that he owns. It's got a catchy chorus.
I think we've established on the podcast that I'm more of a poptimist than most.
Right.
I'm drawn to vocal hooks and a more pop sound. And I take this and I look at people like Elvis Costello and I just think of the era, this is the single that I enjoy the most. I would regularly play this. I think you can play it in most contexts. I think it works at a party, but it also works introspectively, just listening to it on your own. And yeah, so I think my tastes have kind of led me to this particular choice, just through the fact that I think it's a great hooky pop single more than anything else.
Perfectly fair.
Tom, what's your favourite single from the period?
This was really, really hard.
It's a difficult question.
I don't listen to singles particularly. I tend to listen to albums, particularly from that era. And I thought long and hard about it. My first go-to straight away was going to be Making Plans for Nigel by XTC. That was going to be my first choice.
I love that track.
But then I settled on Boys Don't Cry by The Cure because
it's a seminal single.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very obvious choice, I'm sure. But I mean, The Cure for me, I first discovered. So my piano teacher, he's going to come up again later with my album pick, but he's a bit younger than my parents. So like, my mum was very into music, but she was at university between 75 and 78, and as she herself says, by 78 she'd gone off into reggae and sort of left rock behind. And so this era I didn't have much exposure to, but I started having piano lessons when I was about 4, and the guy who taught me was a guy down the road who worked on roofs with my dad, who they used to call Intellectual Mike, because he was had very strong opinions about music. I remember when I was 12, I played a half-term concert at our secondary school where everyone plays, we just started secondary school and everybody plays a piece that they've been working on. And I played John McCabe's 5 Bagatelles for piano, which is 20 minutes long and doesn't have a single melody. So that sort of tells you the sort of chap my piano teacher was. And he used to turn up for my piano lessons on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. And these piano lessons would sometimes go on for 4 hours because he'd turn up with some records and we'd go through those and we'd work out what I wanted to play. But he always used to wear this beaten up Cure t-shirt. And I'd never actually heard The Cure until I was about 5 or 6, and it was 5 CDs for 30 quid in Virgin Megastore. And my mum gave me 30 quid, and I saw a Cure album and I went and bought it. And then from there, I've sort of explored the rest of their back catalogue. And this is a classic track. It's not my favourite Cure track. I think they got better later, but I think it's still important. I think it's still played on the radio today. Probably because of how hooky the vocals are. As much as anything, the vocal line resonates with people today like it did when it was written. And I think sonically it hasn't aged particularly badly. I think Robert Smith's vocals are great. I love The Cure's sound. I mean, I remember reading a book about post-punk, and they grouped The Cure in with all the other post-punk bands, but I always thought they sounded a bit poppier than the other ones. It's an obvious choice, but I'm going for it. I can't make my case as articulately as Dan because it was a last-minute switch.
Oh, mine was too. I might change it again in a minute. There's so many good songs from this period. But yeah, Boys Don't Cry is one of the greatest singles of this era, and it put The Cure on the map for sure, and that was never going to be a bad thing. Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me is my favourite Cure album. That came in 87, which was my favourite year in music. But yeah, early Cure is important, and you get that post-punk vibe from them that would be so prevalent in the early 80s. So it's certainly got a case for being one of the most influential songs of that period, for sure, yeah.
I think The Cure always managed to seem incredibly playful and incredibly morose at the same time.
Yeah.
It's a curious combination with, a lot of it bound up, I suppose, in the character of Robert Smith. And of course, proto-gothic, along with Susie and the Banshees as well. Because goth was a huge thing. I mean, goth got a bit daft and a bit banal, whatever. But it was, Fields of the Nephilim and people like that. But goth was almost a kind of, all the goths read Melody Maker in the late 80s, and so it was almost like a tremendous subsidy, really. You could, it gave us the sort of readership and enabled us to kind of explore more extreme things, some of which were a kind of sort of jump off from goth, really, Nick Cave, Young Gods, all these kind of people. So again, with The Cure, I kind of appreciated them from afar, but I don't think I ever knowingly bought or acquired a Cure record in my life. You heard it, and this is another great difference between this era and our own era. Part of my drive, actually being a sort of listener, being critic, was resentment of the stuff that I was hearing all the time but didn't necessarily want to.
Yeah,
I'd take a random track, Baby Jane by Rod Stewart, which I think is one of the most horrible tracks ever recorded.
That's my favourite Rod Stewart
song. Is it? Oh, there you go.
I'm with you, David.
Dozens of times, but that doesn't happen anymore. Whatever's happening now that's rubbish, I just don't hear it. It just doesn't happen. I am able to sort of live in a bubble and only hear the things I actually like. Perhaps, I don't know, it's just a shift in the environment, the sonic environment. I think it's the same for everybody, really. That whole dimension that used to drive me as a critic of wanting, of seeking out things that I thought were superb because I hated the stuff that I was actually getting kind of bombarded with on a regular basis. That's kind of gone, really.
I suppose with the rise of Spotify and Apple Music, you can listen to whatever you want to, really, which is a good thing, but then does have its drawbacks. You do tend to listen to what you like all the time. David, what's your favourite single from this period?
internationally in this era, I think the undoubted, and in terms of the main impact it had on British music, internationally, I think that it's undoubtedly the most significant is "I Feel Loved" by Donna Summer, because so much proceeds from that, and it's the sort of sequencer-driven launch of the immediate future. But of course, in British terms, I would probably go for the very first Public Image single in 1978. I was talking earlier on about being a little bit concerned that punk had just given away to this sort of slightly poppy, jerky, zany, coloured rimmed glasses sort of new wave, the Rosillos and all that kind of thing, and finding it just a little bit try. But of course, finally you get a context for like Lydon and that voice. I mean, with the Sex Pistols, obviously I always found out Lydon's scabrous, cottony disdain. It wasn't even singing, it was just scathing. I found out McManus, but I found that Steve Jones's guitar, it's relatively sort of conventional heavy rock, really. He's a good, competent rocker or whatever. But when it's Public Image and you got Keith Levine with this incredible open tuning and that aluminium type sort of guitar, like cascading or whatever. I mean, that's a perfect match. Plus Jar Wobble with his bass introducing that kind of sort of heavy sort of dubby element, which you don't really get on at all on the Sex Pistols. I thought, yeah, this is the perfect showcase. This is the stuff. And sure enough, all that big cavernous, reproachful sound or whatever that you get on that particular single, into that space move, for instance, I don't know, Joy Division and stuff like that. I mean, Susie and the Banshees are kind of doing something similar at the same time. But this for me, it feels like the inauguration of post-punk.
It's a very important single. I think it's in terms of influence, definitely. And Jar Wobble's bass playing is also very influential. I remember spending ages just listening to Public Image Limited. I haven't listened to it for about 10 years, but when I was at university, they were one of the bands that we were listening to because lots of the bands that we were going to see were mentioning them in interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, they go on to make Metal Box in '79, which is just absolutely immense. But they lose so much. When all those members start to drop away, Keith Levine and Jar Wobble, whatever. When Jar Wobble drops away, so he's not on Flowers of Romance, and then when Keith Levine drops away, they're just not the same group. Public Image. You needed those three for the chemistry to work. And then so much comes from that. And again, there's another thing about the first single is that the fact that beginning, it's like with a lot of like really, really significant records, there is this sense of like, this is this is something new introducing itself. And the fact that it starts off with hello, 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 and in a funny kind of way, it reminds a little bit of like Pierre Schaeffer and the Symphonie pour un homme seul, which is one of the great music concrete things, and at the beginning of that, it's like, ahoy! There's a sense of like, and a knocking, like it's literally announcing itself as something new.
It's one of the lost arts of naming a single after the band. You don't get that much anymore.
Yeah.
The only band I can think of in recent memory that does it, and they don't release it as a single, but the 1975 always have a track called the 1975 to open their album.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lost art. You don't get many self-titled singles anymore. So it gets respect from me just from that.
Talk, of course. Talk.
Yeah.
A bit later on, yeah.
We'll move on to discussing the most overrated acts from the time. This could be quite controversial. I opened last time, so Tom, I'm going to throw this one over to you so that you can offend everybody and then receive all the hate in the comments first.
I'm going to get strung up for this. It was between two for me, and Dan's taken the other one. So
yeah.
But for me, in this era, specifically this era, the most overrated band is Pink Floyd. The reason being, right, so I have tried many times to listen to The Wall. I really dislike it. It's Andrew Lloyd Webber style musical theatre held up as high art. I find. I think Dave Gilmour is an overrated guitarist. I don't think he's got much to say. Not when you think that The Wall came out the same year that Gang of Four released their debut album. I don't. So I think musically they'd run out of things to say with what they were doing. I think Syd Barrett's era Pink Floyd were brilliant because I think he gave them something. He gave them something to say, and I think by The Wall for me is It's overly pompous. It's basically a bad musical. And I don't think it's particularly well performed. And also Animals was 77, which I have memories of being at university, at Exeter University, and Animals is the sort of album where I'm sure for decades, middle class or upper class kids would sit in a room and get stoned to and tell me how important a record it was. And I was just thinking that in 77, Wire released Pink Flag. Like, you cannot tell me that Animals is a more important record than Pink Flag. It's just no. So yeah, I really, they are without a doubt the most overrated of that era, I think, because it's just dull. It's just so. I mean, and some people say to me, "Oh, well, maybe you don't like concept albums." I was like, I can name three concept albums I love by prog rock bands, and there's two by Yes, Close to the Edge and Tales from Topographic Oceans, and Genesis, Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And the thing that makes those albums more interesting, I think, is that those prog bands work because they've got better keyboard players and classically trained guitarists. And I think that's they bring that. So like Tony Banks and Rick Wakeman are much more interesting keyboard players than, I think, is it Richard Wright for Pink Floyd?
Right, yeah.
Who then went on to playing golf at Ipswich.
So yeah, that's my choice. And like I say, I've given my justification, and I'll sit back and eat humble pie now.
I mean, it's hard really to sort of set Pink Floyd in that era because, of course, one of like the ways the Sex Pistols announced themselves was with John Lydon's "I Hate Pink Floyd" T-shirt, finding himself, as the future will be anti-Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd, and obviously, punk did cleave rock history in two, certainly in the UK. But it's interesting that people like that Pink Floyd still managed to sort of commercially survive and thrive. There were still plenty of people who weren't sort of necessarily taking the old punk Kool-Aid. And by 79, I mean, with The Wall, it's pretty much the Roger Waters show at that point. I mean, Dave Gilmour writes virtually nothing. I think he gets about one co-compositional credit. Rick Wright who always seemed quite central in very early Pink Floyd. He wrote a couple of the songs or whatever, and the keyboards featured quite a lot. He's a very marginal figure. I think around about this time he was actually sort of sacked with the band, and he was just paid as a sort of almost like a sort of session musician. He was. So you sense that their hearts aren't in it really. And as you say, it's very clunky, didactic. Yes, I mean Lloyd Webber is a good comparison really. I remember, at the time, I did still take Pink Floyd quite seriously because I've been through a big Pink Floyd phase, and I do remember sort of taping off the radio Roger Waters giving a track by track explanation of each song. And what its significance was, and the significance was pretty transparent in the lyrics. Is there anybody out there? But at that point, I think I was in that kind of early phase of being impressed by anything kind of didactic and with a sort of higher moral purpose in music, and that was a sort of proof of its superiority. But no, I mean, it's not an album I've returned to over the years, and when I have, I've found it just as turgid and tedious as you do.
With The Wall being a double album as well.
Oh, very important, yeah.
A double album for me has to be something that's really special to maintain your attention for that length of time. I don't think The Wall's got it for me. I've tried it multiple times and I never come out of it thinking, I've enjoyed that entire experience. Whereas if you compare it to London Calling's a double album, that seems to engage me throughout. And you've obviously got Songs in the Key of Life, not British, but that's a double album that works. It's not the concept of a double album doesn't put me off. It's just it has to be really good to be a good double album. And I don't think The Wall really. I guess I kind of have to say that it would be overrated because it does get so many plaudits, and I've never really come out of it thinking this is an exceptional record. I think for me, Wish You Were Here from 1975 is my favourite Pink Floyd project, and by merit of it not being in this particular era that we're talking about, I can roll with them being overrated if we're talking in this era, certainly.
Yeah, my favourite Pink Floyd album is Ummagumma.
I've never heard that one.
Again, that feels like it's space rock, and that's hugely influential on krautrock.
Yeah, so I say I love Sid Barrett era Pink Floyd, and I do like those albums, but I would actually add that, strangely, probably my favourite Pink Floyd album is Atom Heart Mother, which is my mum's favourite Pink Floyd album, which I listened to a lot because she had. So in her record collection, she had Relics, which is like a compilation of the early stuff, Saucer Full of Secrets, Atom Heart Mother, Ummagumma, everything up to Dark Side of the Moon, and then gave up buying it.
Yeah,
because I think that she found Dark Side of the Moon a bit too pompous. But then at that era, she was listening to Can. So I think if you were listening to lots of Can, you probably would find Dark Side of the Moon a bit pompous.
Yeah. a lot of people involved in the whole post-punk scene were listening to krautrock because it was an implicit rejection of prog rock and its superiority complex and its sense of like rock music graduating perhaps towards some sort of classical symphonic status. That conceit, basically, I think, there was a sort of rejection of that in a lot of the best new gem music, which is why everyone from John Lydon, Julian Cote, and Pete Shelley and people like that, and Mark E. Smith, really related to, the likes of Faust, Can, and all that. And I think, again, that The Wall is a survival of something that punk was really supposed to have banished, really, was that sort of idea of rock as a kind of, like wisdom dispensed from on high, by serious and proper musicians and thoughtful men. All that kind of conceit, really. It's almost, a culmination of that, really, is The Wall, even though it's occurred 2 years after punk. Even though Pink Floyd have survived the Sex Pistols at this point, have outlived them.
I'm going to nominate Queen. We have a bit of a storied history on this podcast with Queen in that they do tend to get a kicking every now and again.
Always from me.
I wasn't sure if I really wanted to go there because there is a lot of Queen stuff, early Queen stuff that I really like. Queen 2 is a really good album, and A Night at the Opera is, for me, their only masterpiece in terms of what they put together with the resultant albums. But if you look at Queen from this era, this is the era in which they did News of the World, which starts off with We Will Rock You, and then track 2 is We Are the Champions. And I just think that's just 2 tracks that I would never want to listen to in any context anymore. Nothing ever really gets any better than that on that album. I just think it's a bit of a waste of 40 minutes, that album. So that's why I kind of have to have them, because they're held up as this big institution within British music, and their output is very patchy. And I don't think they released more than one really good album, being A Night at the Opera, and this was the start of the diminishing returns. They did release some good singles in the 80s, and as Dave has mentioned on the podcast, the album Hot Space in 82 it's got some good synth pop experiments on it, and of course it has Under Pressure with David Bowie. So they never stopped being worthy of a listen to every now and again. But I think this is the start of all their projects being massively overblown, them getting a lot of praise for music that there were artists, contemporary artists at the time, that were doing much better. If you want to consider them with the likes of Electric Light Orchestra, for instance, I think the ELO were doing much better stuff than Queen were capable of. Even Supertramp, Breakfast in America, is a better album, a better pop rock album than what Queen were putting out at the time, certainly in terms of its consistency. So that's why I'm going to nominate Queen.
77 to 79, Queen was very much a big thing. I think similarly a friend of mine dismissed Bohemian Rhapsody in a review in just 3 words. It just said gale force rubbish. And
yes, I like that friend of yours already. He's on my wavelength.
Yes, and I think there was a lot of that. The problems I have with Queen, I do have my moments with Queen where I engage with them. Not enough. We Will Rock You is one of them. I think I do like that. There are various things. The fact that they played Sun City is obviously a huge that mark is one thing. Brian May, the tuning of Brian May's guitar, I never liked it. That horrible, weedy, I just find it immensely irritating.
Sounds like he's always feeding his guitar to a kazoo.
Yeah. So there's all of that, as you say. I mean, I've never really kind of explored Queen in great depth, so I'm a greatest hits guy, really.
Yeah, I think that's all you need with Queen, if I'm honest.
Yeah. I've never actually sat down and tried to listen to a Queen album. Another alienating thing about Queen's albums is that in the 70s, certainly, they always have no synthesizers were used in the making of this album.
Yeah.
This is proper music. Again, that sort of prog conceit or whatever. That it's all about technique, it's all about virtuosity and not about concepts and ideas.
The irony being that all the good prog bands had synthesizer players.
Yeah.
I think it's something that dropped earlier on, but it's that real musicians' union sort of sense of the inauthenticity of synthesizers has obviously got my goat a little bit. But with Queen, of course, they did have a significant role, I think, in the mid '80s with Live Aid and when Freddie Mercury. Who does have a certain kind of star quality and was one who understood how to kind of manipulate and how to work to a mass audience like that. And I think that's a very kind of significant moment, really, in rock and pop music, not necessarily for the good, but throughout the 80s, as a post-punk thing, I mean, everything was quite tribal and fractious and, more intimate audiences. And, there was a whole idea of like stadium rock or whatever was far too remote a proposition. There needed to be much more kind of intimacy between bands and the music and the musician, and that the people watching could feel that they too could form a band. It all seemed much more accessible. And I think that Live Aid represented the beginning of a hankering for people to gather en masse the way they had done in the late 60s, massive festivals or whatever, and to adore and all of these things that punk had, supposedly discredited. I think there was a sort of hankering to get back together again en masse among people. And it starts with, I think, with Live Aid is the first great spectacle of that. And then it kind of kicks on lately with rave and, or mass phenomena like something like the Stone Roses, I Want to Be Adored. And they were adored, it's hard to imagine why. And I think that it was Freddie Mercury, the fact that he was able to sort of work that crowd so adeptly that almost like triggered a revival of the mass audience en masse, together en masse in the outdoors or whatever, as a kind of significant component in rock and pop music.
And I do think that Freddie Mercury was an exceptional frontman. I don't think there's any getting around that. Yeah. But I just think that there's this there's this almost renaissance in modern culture especially since 91 when he died, that he's seen as one of the possibly the greatest frontman ever. And my musical taste, I listen to a lot of funk music and a lot of soul music from the 60s, 70s and 80s. And I just don't think he's anywhere near the level that James Brown could be on stage. For me, Freddie's not in that conversation, but I certainly recognise how important he was to pop music, the live scenario. And as you say, Live Aid, the call and response is iconic. But I just think as a band, this you've touched on Brian May's guitar tone. It's not something that I really think is that great. There's not a lot of texture to it. I think that Roger Taylor's drumming is often quite bass. There's not a lot of flourish to it. And I actually think my favourite musician in Queen is John Deacon. And he, of course, left the business rather unceremoniously after Queen finished in 91. They're still going technically, but he's just done with it. There's almost like an element of humility in him just disappearing from it. And he was just about the music, and I like that. And Queen as a whole, I just think that there's a lot of inconsistency there, but they seem to be held up as this paradigm within music that I just don't think their body of work reflects.
There's always been somebody doing something better than them, so doing what they do better, but they've always sold better, perhaps undeservingly. I mean, my problem with Queen is that I dislike Queen for the same reason I dislike Wagner, and that large swathes of it have this real sort of patriotic bigness to them. That's not a word, I know.
Bigly.
We go with Trump-esque, but it's I really dislike the pomposity of it, and they don't have the musical chops to back it up. Brian May's guitar tone, as you've already pointed out, is dull. Roger Taylor's drumming is pedestrian. Freddie Mercury has got a decent voice, but his lyrical themes are banal. I mean, it's just not. They're just not a band I like. They're not a band I can get behind. And every time I hear it, it just turns me off. It's like in their early stages of their career, they were trumpeted as this sort of heavy rock version of prog. And I was like, I'm sorry, King Crimson released Red in 71. You know, you cannot tell me that Queen were never as heavy as King Crimson's Red, and their guitar tone was never as good. Yes, they wrote some anthemic songs, but like, I'd say Never Mind the Bollocks has some properly anthemic songs on it, you know, in the same era. And it's just, no, they're just not a band that I can ever get behind. If I never heard a Queen song again, I would be really happy about it. Gale Force Rubbish is a perfect... I'm going to use that again on a future every time they come up in future episodes, I think.
Saves a bit of time, I suppose, doesn't it? I mean, that guitar solo one, I Want to Break Free, it's just awful.
It's on a synthesizer, I think.
Oh, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so they didn't have a no synthesizers used on the making of this album on that one.
It just sounds like he's sort of plucking painfully.
Is it not a talk box done badly?
I don't quite. Yeah, I mean, you might well be right. Yeah, but I find it an excruciating sound. You know, I find it.
It is an excruciating sound. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you think about Jimi Hendrix and the way that like the liquid flows from his fretboard, you know, the wah wah and stuff like that, and this just sounds horribly painful and constipated. Like it's plucking hairs from a cat.
I don't think he's got the fluency of some of the... Like, Hendrix is fluent, and Hendrix cares about what he sounds like. You know, all the hair metal bands talking about cranking it up to 11. I mean, Hendrix did that to get his tone, because it's the only way you could get a valve amp to overdrive, you know? It's like Hendrix's guitar tone is perfect, and his playing is fluid, and it's almost like you watch Hendrix play and he never looks at his fingers, and you watch Brian May play and he spends a lot of time looking down at his hand. He's just not a fluid guitarist in the same way as the greats are.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guitar solo on Want to Break Free sounds like what the solo on Easy by the Commodores would sound like if it was heard by a child. David, who would you say is the most overrated act from 1977 to 1979 in British music?
Well, I'm going to go for this guy for perhaps not quite the same reasons as Pink Floyd and Queen, in a sense. I'm going to go for Elvis Costello.
Okay.
Now, the thing about Elvis Costello is that I think he was properly rated. It just annoys me that he was around and he was rated to the extent that he does, because I think all through the 80s, I always felt that, like, he was the epitome of that kind of stiff records guy, you know, like to very jerky, singing like that, and I always felt that the quality of his work validated that particular scene, which I just thought needed to be done away with. Really, it was like somebody being an absolutely brilliant trad jazzer or something like that in the 60s, and their popularity and the attention paid to them, taking away space from more ambitious, you know, sonically ambitious stuff. I get the feeling that that whole scene that he kept it alive, and there was the attention paid to Elvis Costello and the whole idea that music was really about, you know, great songs and obliquely written lyrics and all that kind of jerkiness, to me was at odds with the way that I thought that left field rock music should be going. So I suppose I always had a sort of resentment for him on that particular basis. And so it's not so much that Elvis Costello himself is overrated on his own terms or whatever. I'm sure, I mean, I'm taking it on faith, you know, from people that I know that kind of know their stuff, that they were right to kind of rate his albums as highly as they did. But I just always found it depressing when his albums ended up as being album of the year or something like that, and like Suicide, say, was at number 18 or something like that. And I just felt, you know, so I just felt the attention paid to him was dispiriting. So you know, that's perhaps slightly bending the rules.
No, it's certainly valid. I think what I'm surmising there is that it sounds like Elvis Costello in the late 70s was very much the Ed Sheeran is now. It's kind of like singer-songwriter. He's fairly competent, but it just don't understand why music has brought him to the forefront of pop.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, this year's Model is a fantastic album.
Yeah.
That's my favourite.
Should it have been up there in Album of the Year lists from 78? Probably not. And I think that's exactly the point you're making, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is, so yeah, I can see that. Although I think with Elvis Costello, I think he was overrated at the time and possibly not so overrated now, if that makes sense. So I think now we look back at the late 70s and we possibly don't rate him as highly. I can see definitely where you're coming from anyway.
Yeah, Pump It Up is a classic. I like that song. It's been sampled many times as well, so it offers a lot to pop music going forwards. But I've never really listened to Elvis Costello a huge amount. As Thomas said, 1978, there's so many great albums coming out at that time. Elvis Costello wouldn't really be on the radar. If you open it up broader, we're looking at British music, but 1978, you've got the Cars' debut self-titled album. For me, that's album of the year for 1978 because I think it's the greatest debut album by anyone. Yeah, Elvis Costello isn't in the running for me there. Speaking of great albums, though, we will move on to our final category. Let's have Tom open up the discourse with what his favourite British album is from 1977 to 1979. Hit me, Tom.
Yeah, so this is possibly a little bit obscure, but it's an album that I grew up with. I grew up between a derelict house in Plymouth and a caravan on the north coast of Cornwall. And my dad had an old Volkswagen Caravelle that only had a tape deck in the car. And my piano teacher gave us on cassette, copied from the vinyl, a cassette. And on one side of it was Fisher's Edward Salad, and on the other side was Red Skies Over Paradise. And we used to listen to that on the way down to the caravan. And so it's got a lot of memories for me. But yeah, Fisher's Edward's Word Salad is going to be my pick. It's a really nice album. Lyrically, it's very interesting because John Watts, who trained as a clinical psychologist before, his lyrics touch on some interesting themes. It's a nice blend between punk and reggae. I mean, they toured with Bob Marley, didn't they, around that era? So they were in with the reggae scene. It's got a post-punk sound to it. His vocals are very distinctive. And yeah, lyrically, it's clever and interesting, and the choruses are nice. So yeah, I'm going Fisher's Edward Salad.
Well, interesting. Yeah, I know very little about Fisher's Ed. Not nothing. I vaguely was a big Frank Zappa fan. I went through a big Frank Zappa phase. Yeah. And Fisher's Ed, I kind of associate with Frank Zappa.
Yeah, there's that experimental rock blues element to it. I think it reminds me of a cross between the lead vocals are almost like Roger Hodgson from Supertramp, cross with David Byrne. It was certainly different than I expected from Tom. I'm not massively familiar with it. I did listen to some of the tracks from the album. Pretty Paracetamol, the opener's good. I really liked The Worker and Spiders as well.
Every track on it is very good. Pretty Paracetamol, the lyrics are really clever. Yeah, I think every track on it works really, really well. And it's a debut album again. So it's like he met Steve Skolnick, I think he's called off the top of my head, while they were studying, and they formed the band together, and this was their first release. I don't think the production on it's aged as well as their 1981 album, Red Skies Over Paradise, but I think it has aged well, and it's aged in a similar way to The Cars. You can listen to The Cars today and you can tell it was written then, but it doesn't make you want to turn it off because it was recorded dreadfully, if that makes any sense. So yeah, it's an album worth going back to. And I kind of figured that, so we have a podcast group chat, and when Dan was like, what's your album of that period going to be? There are so many I could have picked. I mean, I had to, again, XTC Drums and Wires, Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures. There's lots of albums I could have gone with that probably deserve more acclaim than Word Salad, but from a personal perspective, and because it's so hard to pick otherwise.
Yeah.
It is very much an impossible question, this one. It's one of the more difficult ones we've asked on this podcast. My tastes, I tend to be more Americanized in the pop culture that I do digest. So this period, as I've said earlier, I was massively into funk and soul. So a lot of the albums that I know from bands like Cameo, Parliament, Funkadelic, Confunction, the Fatback Band, all that kind of thing. And this is their era where they're making waves. Prince was coming out 78.
I was listening to all of that.
That's kind of my bread and butter. So what I did is I went back and I listened to a lot of the classics from this era. I listened to Breakfast in America by Supertramp, which is a wonderful album. I listened to The Kick Inside by Kate Bush, which is again an exceptional album. There were so many records. ELO's Discovery is a particularly great record. I know my dad loves that one. And there are just so many records. The Clash's London Calling, as I mentioned earlier, wonderful record. You've got the Police as well, putting out Regatta de Blanc, got Outlanders de Moya. What I've settled on eventually, I'm a massive David Bowie fan, and my favourite David Bowie album just precedes this era, Station to Station. And I've always looked on the Berlin trilogy as a bit of an oddball, and it's such a left field move for a mainstream artist to make in the late 70s, to go and work with Brian Eno, keep Tony Visconti on board, but work with Brian Eno and produce these mainly instrumental albums. I listened to Heroes and it's great. Heroes itself is the epicenter of that album, and it's difficult to love the rest of the album as much of that because it's such an exceptional track. But the album that I am going to nominate as my favourite of that period, it is Low, first of the Berlin trilogy. Because similar to, we talked on our Prince episode about our favourite Prince albums, and I actually nominated Lovesexy at the time. That's since changed because it always does. Lovesexy is a move from a mainstream artist who's had perhaps their magnum opus in Sign of the Times and then says, right, I'm going to just do something that I want to do. And critics be damned in Lovesexy. And I think that Low is very much that moment for David Bowie. So he had the cocaine addiction throughout the mid-70s, living in America. I think he lived on a diet of milk and red peppers, which is never going to be healthy, but somehow produced all this wonderful writing. And Low is when he had enough of that and moved from America to Germany. The first half of the album is this weird, almost it's almost got this kind of computer chip glitch feel to some of the tracks, like What in the World. There's these weird percussive elements, and they've changed the sound of the snare drum all the way through to really sound quite futuristic. On the opener, which is The Speed of Sound. It's an instrumental, but yeah, there's all these weird percussive sounds. It's very futuristic, and it's very happy and uplifting. But the lyrical themes are quite depressive and contemplative. And the second half of the album, then slowly over time, it descends into this really ambient, almost proggy, jazzy. There's a lot of like wordless vocals and things like that. I just think it's a really bold and brave move for an artist. Yeah,
and I think those kind of ambient sort of elements, they're probably there was a sort of mutual influence, with Eno and Cluster, Rodelius and Dieter Mobius, which is. But I think that for me, it's immensely significant, the very fact that David Bowie does the Berlin trilogy, the fact that he relocates, because it is just this. This wonderful dialectical shift. As you say, he'd been out in America, and I think the kind of people he was hanging around with, like Harry Nilsson, whatever, were evidence that like rock was kind of washed out state by the mid-70s. Kind of screwed up on drugs or whatever, and that basically it had gone west and it could go no further, really. The people didn't have any new ideas, anywhere else to go. Led Zeppelin, people like that. They around that sort of time, they were still big, but they were kind of bloated. They weren't really at the most kind of inspired phase of their career, whatever. John Lennon's another one. He was finished really by this point. And I think that, messed up as he was, David Bowie understood this, and he understood that there had to be a great shift from west to east, from America to Europe. Yeah. And I think that is what, apart from also trying to kind of clean up his personal act as well, that is what took him to Berlin. Obviously the great influence of Eno. He was conscious of Kraftwerk. He was conscious of all of these things that were happening in the whole krautrock scene in the mid-70s. And what happened with Bowie doing that is he kind of conferred his blessing on krautrock, on West German experimental music. And
Yeah.
because before that, it was considered a bit of a joke, as the Germans trying to make some music, and in, an enemy or whatever, they'd still have, it was the headline would be Achtung, and we have ways of making you listen. And, and Kraftwerk had a feature, a double-page feature, and they used a kind of, on the backdrop, they used an image of the Nuremberg rally, because, Kraftwerk are German, why wouldn't you? There's a lot of kind of laughing, chuckling and chortling at the idea of German to me. But then once David Bowie decreed West German music to be the coolest thing on the planet, then everyone, if you say so, Mr. Bowie. And, and he sensed that kind of percolating through later on with, names like Bauhaus, Spandau Ballet or whatever, that suddenly the Germanic is cool and it's no longer a sort of Fawlty Towers type joke. So I think that's probably the most significant thing about, apart from its intrinsic merits, is the significant thing about the Berlin Trilogy.
So I've heard many people say that Low is a great album if you're going through a tough time, because it's so as I mentioned, the lyrical themes are so at odds with the upbeat music, and especially in the first half of the album, that it helps people get through some really difficult times, and you can hear that in what Bowie was recording, that he was going through a difficult time surrounding his identity. And a lesser artist wouldn't come out as strong. I think they would get lost in the shuffle when they really have to switch up their entire shtick and become a different artist. And I think it really cements David Bowie as one of the all-time greats, because he could go from something as soulful as Young Americans to then something as cold and as desolate as Station to Station, and then another shift just a year later to this big Eastern European sound with tracks like Borsava, but also you've got one of the greatest singles that he ever did on that album as well, in Sound and Vision, which I think is one of the all-time great Bowie singles. I mean, Heroes came out a year later, and that's probably the definitive single of the period. But I think Sound and Vision gets overlooked, especially for a song that takes 1.5 minutes for vocals to actually come in. It's still a storming pop single. Like, I don't know how he pulled that off. Not many people can, and not many people will in the future. But it's a real statement of intent from Bowie on a lot of levels. It followed the movie as well, which is The Man Who Fell to Earth. And it took me a couple of goes to really get to grips with Low, because it's such an oddball in his discography, which is already full of these varied and different records. But especially after watching The Man Who Fell to Earth, where he plays this alien character, it makes a lot of sense afterwards. You kind of identify with what he was going through at the time and the transitions in his life. And I think if you're going to listen to Low and you've never listened to it before, it's worth checking out the movie beforehand to really get some context as to where he was at that point in time. So yeah, I'd thoroughly recommend that movie as a companion piece. Low is, for me, the greatest.
It's probably one of my favourite Bowie albums. I think I have to put Hunky Dory at number one, because it's the first album that was ever played when I was born. So it's the album my parents put on when they got me back from the hospital. So I think I've got to put that first, but So Low's a close second. And I think Brian Eno I think David Bowie chose his collaborators very well. And I think Brian Eno was a very good choice, because I think it's 77's when Brian Eno starts moving towards this sort of music for airports and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So he was in Roxy Music doing weird stuff with synthesizers that don't have any keys.
Only for the first 2 albums, though.
For the first 2 albums. And then he goes off and he does Here Come the Warm Jets, which is just has like flashes of punk in it. And then it's got that beautiful instrumental outro, the title track. And then he gradually gets more and more experimental through his discography. Like, is it Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, and then Another Green World, and then it's directly after that sort of that he's working with David Bowie. So I think Bowie's picked his collaborator very well there, and by changing his sound, Bowie was very clever in that I think he prolonged his career for another few decades, whereas I think if he hadn't released the Berlin Trilogy, I think he'd have disappeared into irrelevance.
Definitely, yeah.
You can see the kind of collaborator that Brian Eno was just by the virtue of how different Roxy Music became when he left. And I don't think any of their albums around this time. I think you got Flesh and Blood, Manifesto around this time. The albums just aren't the same without Eno. That's not to say the Roxy music were bad, because I think Dance Away was possibly in contention for being one of my favourite singles of the time, especially the 12-inch version of Dance Away, which is phenomenal. But you can really see that he was so vital to the experimental sound of their first few albums that he was absolutely the ideal collaborator for Bowie at the time.
I think probably the last track is on For Your Pleasure, and the title track, and the last few minutes of that are essentially almost like making this grand exit with this kind of wonderful kind of processed. Right. Well, but after that, they're close to something like Spandau Ballet or whatever. After all,
when you see the record sleeve for Your Pleasure, my mum's got it, and when you fold out the gatefold, I think you can sort of see that the band are about to fall apart, because you look at what Brian Eno's wearing. They're all wearing suits, and then Brian Eno is wearing basically a dress covered in like sparkly feathers, and I think you could see that was the beginning of the end for his passage with the band.
I think it was a bit of an ego. I think there's only room for one Brian in this group.
Brian Ferry, the best singer who can't sing, or one of the best singers who can't sing.
I love Brian Ferry's voice. Idiosyncratic, but it's great. The warbling kind of thing that he does is amazing. David, if this is the final selection for today, what is the pièce de résistance in terms of the best album from this period?
I'm going to go for 154 by Wire, because actually 77 to 79, it's a kind of nice progress. It's I always like. I mean, I talked earlier on about my dislike of conceit, but I make a distinction between from conceit and pretentiousness, which I like.
Yes.
I don't think pretentiousness needs to be a pejorative word. And I think there was always something pretentious about Wire in that good sense. I mean, they started off as interesting because they're associated with punk because of Pink Flag in 1977, but they're actually signed as a kind of art rock proposition, really, by Harvest. That was what the intention was. They weren't signed up to, like the Damned or something like that, to be a punk group. So it's almost like Pink Flag is like, it's ostensibly a punk record or whatever. But I think there was always this consciousness that they're going to kind of progress from there. And so you got these two sets. You got that, and then you've got Chairs Missing, which is there's the gradual addition of adornments. And then the sort of colorization and the elements of electronics and synth that you get with the glorious 154 culminating in a track like Map Reference. And again, by this stage, they are unabashedly pretentious in that good sense. I mean, there's on the opening track, I don't think there's any other time when I've ever heard the word albeit used in a rock lyric. You get that on I Should Know Better. And so I always like that. But at the same time, there was that punkish knowingness, strongly implied in Colin Newman's vocals, so, it's almost like they're sly. They kind of know what they're doing. They know who they're teasing. By this time, after this, they did Document and Eyewitness, and they did these gigs which were like sort of Dadaist kind of happenings on stage. And it's almost like they're kind of provoking this lumpen element that always stuck with them, that just want them to do 1, 2, X, yo, ding, 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 do. They'd pretend they were going to play it and then stop and stuff like that. And there was always an element, this, like I say, this lumpen punk element who didn't really understand that punk was something that you moved on from. You didn't just stick loyally with. Who always wanted them just to play, the old sort of terse gobbet classics from Pink Flag. And it's just interesting the way that they kind of deliberately and systematically and provocatively alienate them, and they take rock into this kind of pretentious realm, but without all the sort of pratfalls of prog rock, because they have a very strong kind of Eno-esque conceptual sense of making music, which I think was always lacking in prog. And so, I think just because it's the culmination, it's a sort of a 77 to 79 trilogy. I'd go for 154.
Wire are arguably one of the most important British bands of that era, going from the late 70s into the early 80s, and 154 is a great album. I mean, I came to it a lot later, so I ended up starting with my journey with the band Wire. I ended up started when they released Send in 2003.
Yeah.
Don't remember how I ended. I think it was 2003, Virgin Megastore in Plymouth City Centre was still doing you can buy 5 CDs for 30 quid, and that was my pocket money every month. And it was just, I'll pick 5 new releases that I like the sound of. Oh, Wire, my piano teacher's got a t-shirt with that band on it and they've got a new record out, I'll buy that. So yeah, started with that and then worked backwards. But yeah, 154 is probably my favourite of their albums.
It was an elegant time for them to split as well. You know, they did. I mean, they only split for a few years. They got back together again in about 1985, I think, and they're still, they're still pretty much together ever since. Although Bruce Gilbert has left, but and they've always had that steadfast commitment to the new, to what the recent stuff, everything that they do. I find thoroughly admirable, definitely.
Not an album I'm actually familiar with. I can't say I've heard it. So it's certainly going on this afternoon after we finish recording. It's going to be the next thing I listen to, because I feel there's a gap in my knowledge that I need to fill, because I can't really offer any opinions on it because I've never heard it.
Yeah, you need to. Every semi-pretentious university student should listen to Wire.
See, I was never semi-pretentious. I was full-on pretense the whole way.
I probably was completely pretentious, but I'm trying not to tar myself with that brush. But yeah, it was Wire and Gang of Four and all those artists. So I remember there was an interview with Tom Morello just as he started Audio Slave. When would that have been? 2003, 2004, sometime around then. And he did an interview and he quoted, and there was this giant of American rock music who'd been the guitarist in Rage Against the Machine, talking about how the British post-punk scene in the late 70s was the most influential on his guitar playing.
Yeah.
And I think he did that interview, and every self-respecting student went straight out and bought a load of Wire and Gang of Four records.
Thing is, and this is probably something that a lot of people might say at the time. I wanted to listen to so many things. I actually didn't buy and hear 154 until 1981, because I just had limited funds, and I would read about things and I think, I'm going to like that. It was the same with Pere Ubu. I first read about Pere Ubu in 1978. Never got a chance to hear them or anyway. I just knew from reading about them that I would really love this band. But because of all the various other projects, because of my limited funds, and I was into funk, I was into Frank Zappa, all these other things, Beefheart and Joy Division, I didn't get around to listening to these things until 2 years after the event. Now, of course, these days that would never happen. You never need to wait 2 years to actually hear something. But that's how it was back then.
Have you come across any of the bands that we've talked about in your days as a music journalist? Have you interviewed?
Oh yeah, I've interviewed Wire. And I would always see Graham Lewis when he's in town. Definitely, he lives in Sweden now, so yes, certainly Wire. I got a chance to interview John Lydon recently, but I'm just too depressed about what he's become.
Yeah, it doesn't leave the best taste in your mouth with seeing him on the butter adverts and things like that from what he was in the 70s.
Yeah. As for Elvis Costello, no, I never interviewed him. I did a review once of him quite early on in my Melody Maker career, which expressed a lot of my ambivalence about him by being reviewed in like two debate. It was like a Socratic dialogue type thing. And he sent me a kipper in the post and asked me to slap myself around the face with it a few times, which is marvellous.
Well, at least that's an original retort.
I mean, I'd love to probably chat to David Bowie, especially now. I think I've developed a lot more respect for David Bowie over the last... I mean, remember in 1988 he was doing Tin Machine, and he was considered a bit of a joke because he seemed to be trying to sort of do catch-up with the Pixies and people like that, and just not do it in a very effective way. But... Bowie, and Pink Floyd are always a bit of a remote proposition, so I never had, and Queen and people like that. And what's the sad thing about Freddie Mercury, that I just think that for instance, I wouldn't want to judge him about not coming out, because that's not my call, it's his only. I'd just say that if he had, and if he had been a more kind of vocal, because he just never did interviews or whatever, I think it would be. I would have just that little bit more respect for him. But I mean, that's probably it's out of order. I think to condemn him certainly for not coming out. I mean, I've never had to be hetero. I've always been hetero, so I've not been faced with that. But I think the fact that he just never did interviews, I always found a little bit depressing because he could have added so much more. I think to the gaiety of nations, as it were. Is
there anybody who, at the time, you really didn't think would be that significant, but you have maybe encountered in your later years being a music journalist who you've completely turned around just on the basis of how maybe honest or how well they interviewed?
The point about interviews is an interesting one because I think I came into an era where everybody was a bit kind of heavy-eyelid and neo-psychedelic and not very articulate, and I'd been used to reading interviews in Enemy in the early 80s with people like Marquis Smith and, I don't know, John Lydon and Junior, where people were much sparkier and vivacious and quotable in interviews. And then when I came along, it rolled up. It was people like My Bloody Valentine and Spiritualized and Dinosaur Jr., who almost like made a point of being, we just make the music and anybody else likes it. I guess that's and just weren't really as quotable. But then what I realised is heavy metal, a genre I despised, quite properly despised as being kind of Neanderthal and sexist and reactionary and all that kind of stuff. What I realised is that people from that world, it was a bit like kind of, I don't know, World Wrestling Federation type thing. There were characters, they understood the need to be entertainers and they understood the need to say fun, quotable things. And from a journalistic point of view, I think you'd interview someone like Blackie Lawless out of Wasp or Ozzy Osbourne. And the moment they started talking, it was like, bless you. You could sort of sense the feature writing itself as they spoke. I think Kiss were one of the worst groups that ever existed. And I probably disagree with every single thing that Gene Simmons says and everything that he holds dear. But again, bless you, because it was all usable. It was all great kind of copy.
You mentioned My Bloody Valentine there. We've got Martin, who is a regular on the podcast, is a big fan of them. So have you interviewed them?
I interviewed them, yeah. They're okay.
Just wanted that on record so Martin can hear that and be jealous.
I interviewed them in a pub. Was it in 1990, 1991, possibly around, yeah.
Around Loveless then,
yeah.
So prime.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And To Hear Knows When, which I just think is almost like the equivalent. I always have the metaphor for Hear Knows When. I always thought that like Jimi Hendrix had taken the guitars to a certain point in 1968 with Electric Ladyland, the same year as Bob Beamon jumped 8 meters 90 in the Mexico City Olympics in the long jump, jumped 8 meters 90, and it just seemed unachievable. In 1991, a guy called Mike Powell finally broke that record. He's jumped 8 meters 95, and that is still the world record. And I always think that is the thing that To Hear Knows When, just edges out even like Hendrix in terms of sonic guitar extremes, and nobody has got near since.
So have you got any anything you're writing in the moment, or any projects you're working on that you want to kind of plug?
My third favourite book is a book about British comedy, history of British comedy, but I've tried to approach it in a way, stylistically, in a similar way to the one I did about Mars by 1980, the one about electronic music, and the Krautrock one. So I'm hoping it has a sort of similar sort of feel, even though the subject matter is very, very different, trying to contextualise things, going into the sort of almost like the physicality of the comedy. So yeah, because having done previously as well, Fear of Music: Why People Get Rothko but Don't Get Stockhausen, another book that I did. I feel like I was beginning to sort of repeat myself a bit. People like Stockhausen and Kraftwerk were cropping up in each of these books, and I'm sure there must be some elements of repetition. So I think I'm probably sort of done with that area. But I think I do want to explore this 77, 79 thing. It's not even it's something that I might sort of try and work up into a pitch. But like I say, just look at all aspects of the era. Probably focus on Britain, really. Read every single newspaper and stuff like that, and just really get to try and relive on almost like a day-to-day basis what it was like being in 77 and 79, what it was like being alienated in 77 and 79. What was going on, really. So
we could potentially be blessed with a precursor to your book.
Yeah, that's right.
You heard it here first, people. And of course, you're still very much involved with chart music.
Oh yeah, which is fabulous.
We're big fans of chart music here. We would recommend everybody go and listen to that if they're not familiar with it already. Great great discussions on Top of the Pops, which we've mentioned today, and is sadly missing from today's pop music world. I think it is a big miss, and it's interesting because I listen to the majority of the episodes that you cover on the show are from times where I wasn't even around. So there's something to be gained from just going back and as an outsider and just getting a feel for what pop music was like at the time, and because it's not around anymore, there's this kind of sad disconnect between what times were like and what you can discover, but knowing that it's not going to be there going forwards, it's quite sad.
It's definitely interesting listening back to what was on Top of the Pops then, and the albums that we hold dear from that era. Very, very, very different things. So the albums that have stood the test of time are not necessarily the ones that were on Top of the Pops.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm sure often the ones that weren't.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, David. And we've certainly got some albums that I'm going to be taking away, Wire, for instance, and listening to.
Yeah, I'm going to check out Fisher's Head.
It's a great record, but Wire is better, so you may want to put 154 on again afterwards.
Sounds like I've got a busy afternoon of Wire. I might even watch The Wire afterwards just to really compound my Wire afternoon. Which is one of the greatest TV shows of all time, so I'm just getting that now. So yeah, it's been wonderful having you on, and we hope that people can take away some ideas for albums they haven't discovered already, or if they have heard the albums, then we've done them justice on the podcast. But it's been great to have somebody who's so knowledgeable about this particular era, and all eras indeed. So really thank you for joining us.
Thank you. You guys certainly know your stuff yourself.
Thanks.
We'll be back with more episodes in the future with the regular guys. Our next episode is going to be a punk funk special, so we're going to be debating whether or not punk funk is Rick James and the funkier punk sound of the 70s, or is it LCD Sound System and that kind of movement in the 2000s. So we'll be back with that shortly. In the meantime, you can find us on our blog, thecacophonysessions.wordpress.com, or follow us on Twitter at CACSessionsPod. And David, where can we find you on social media?
At SendVictorious on Twitter.
If you have any questions for David about tonight's episode, or just want to see all the wonderful opinions that you put out on a regular basis on Twitter, then there's that. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for joining us, David. And make sure you stay funky.
Cheers.
Indeed. Thumbs up.